Hello. Today we're going to be solving more Mate and One puzzles, and this time, just like the last one, we'll have a mix between both White's perspective and Black's perspective. In the bottom right corner, there will be a pawn that'll show you who it is to play. You will have 30 seconds to solve each puzzle, and you can always pause the video if you need more time. And if you want more videos like this one, parts 1, 2, and 3 so far, you can always check out the chess playlist. That being said, let's get started. So here's the first puzzle. You have 30 seconds to solve it, starting now. Time is up. The correct move was rook to a2, checkmate. This is checkmate because the king is in check thanks to the a2 rook. The king can't move to a5 or a3 because the rook is still controlling both the squares. And the king can't move to b3 because you can't move to a piece of your own color. The king can't move to b4 because the king on c3 is controlling that square. The king can't move to b5 because of the pawn on c4 who is controlling that square. And there's nothing to block the check. As well as that, there's nothing to capture the rook. You might be thinking, but the pawn on b3 can just capture the rook. Well, it can't, because if it does capture the rook, then the king will be in check from the bishop on d1. If you have trouble like thinking that, just imagine the pawn on b3 wasn't there. It would be a check, right? Yeah, it would. So that's why this is checkmate. Let's move on to the next puzzle. Here's the next puzzle. You have 30 seconds to solve it, starting now. Time is up. The correct move is queen to e3, checkmate. This is checkmate because the king's in check from the e3 queen, and the king can't move to d1 because the rook is there and you can't move to a piece of your own color. The king can't move to f1 because the bishop on d3 is controlling that square. And the king can't move to f2, e2, or d2 because the queen on e3 is controlling all three of those squares. As well as that, there's nothing to capture or block the check on e2. So this is checkmate. Let's move on to the next puzzle. So here's our third puzzle for the day, and you have 30 seconds to solve it, starting now. Time is up. The correct move is queen to b5, checkmate. And if you heard of the dovetail mate before, this is an example of the dovetail mate when the queen is diagonal to the king and there's something else defending that queen. and the two squares that the queen doesn't control is either occupied by a piece of the king's own color or controlled by a piece of the other color to the king. So, in this case, it's a dovetail mate because the queen on b5 is directly diagonal to the king on c4, therefore checking it, and is defended by the a5 king. The king can't move to c5 or d5 because the queen is controlling both those squares, and he can't move to b4 because the queen is also controlling that square, and so is the king. And he can't move to b3 because the queen is controlling that square, and the a2 pawn is as well. Also, the king can't move to d3 because the queen is also controlling that square. And the king can't move to d4 because a black piece is occupying that square. Therefore, the king can't move there. And the king can't move to c3 because the b2 pawn is controlling that square as well. In this case, the two squares that the queen does not control are c3 and d4, which are both either occupied by a white, which are both which one of them is occupied by a black piece and the other is controlled by a white piece. Therefore, this is an example of the dovetail mate. Let's move on to the next puzzle. So here's the next puzzle, and you have 30 seconds to solve it starting now. Time is up. The correct move was rook into h2, a2, checkmate. This is checkmate because the king is in check thanks to the a2 rook, and the king can't move to b2 because the rook is controlling the square. As well as that, the king can't move to b3 because it is occupied by another white piece, and the king can't move to b4 because there's a knight there, a black knight there that is defended by the a5 pawn. Also, the king can't move to a4 because that square is controlled by the a2 rook. If the king moved there, there would be no king on a3 to stop the rook from controlling that, so that is also controlled by the rook. And the king can't capture the rook because it is defended by the b4 knight. There's nothing to block the check because there's no space in between the checking piece and the king, and there's nothing to capture the rook on a2. So this is checkmate. Let's move on to the next puzzle. So here's our next puzzle, and you have 30 seconds starting now. Time is up. The correct move is queen to h8 checkmate. And now, if you recall my explanation of the dovetail mate, this in fact is another example of the dovetail mate because the queen is on a square directly diagonal to the king, and there's a piece either occupying or a white piece controlling the squares, the two squares that the queen cannot control. So the king can't move to f8 or g8 or capture h8 because the rook is controlling all those squares and defending the queen on h8. The king can't move to h7 because the queen is controlling the square. The king can't move to f6 because the queen is also controlling that square. And the king can't move to h6 or f7 because there are black pawns occupying those squares. And the king can't move to g6 because of the queen occupying the square. There's nothing to capture the queen, and since this is a direct attack, there's no way to block it. Therefore, this is checkmate. So those are all the puzzles for today, and I hope you enjoyed. If you have any feedback, you can post it on the forum, which is in the description of all videos. The form is completely anonymous, so I won't know who filled it out. Also, please hit that like button and subscribe for more videos like this one. And if you want more videos, you can always visit the chess playlist. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.